Welcome back to From Pain to Gain. Today we are talking about how music is dangerous. And typically we want to identify what's the gain, not just identifying, this is just painful in the short term or long term. And to help me do that is Jason Montoya, who is on this other side of the screen here.
Jason. Hello, Mr. Ivan. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jason Montoya. Good to meet you in the virtual digital world.
And could you describe just who you are and the amazing successes you've had and what you do now?
Yeah. So my name is Jason Montoya. I am a freelancer, consultant, coach. I work with small business owners to help them grow their sales and influence through digital online content creation and marketing. I'm also a writer. I blog, I podcast. I've written 2 books, working on my 3rd now. One for small business owners, one for freelancing, and working on one for Christians. Do a lot of creation. I'm a very creative person. And actually it was through my former marketing company that I met Ivan many years ago, and we became friends since. So does that cover it?
We're not just friends, we're BFFs, man.
BFF.
Don't diminish me ever.
You get 3.5 Fs on the BFF.
Okay. Thanks. Hey, I just got to call this out because people are all about numbers. Could you just, if you had to put a number amount on your marketing agencies, the transaction you've done, because people just like to hear, I've done probably over $5-10 million worth of deals. People just kind of drive to that. What number would you put on that?
Well, what I would say is I'm a 6-figure annual freelancer, which probably puts me in the top 10% of freelancers in the world. But I'd have to do some more research. But what I would also say is I've been freelancing since 2014. And this year I will cross the $1 million threshold in the amount of income I've generated as a freelancer.
Sweet, man.
So yeah, been doing it a while and it's been working. So that's why I wrote a book on it. And the systems I've created have really helped make that happen and to create that consistency. So.
And you didn't even touch on the marketing company you had before that.
So yeah, I started a marketing agency for 7 years from 2014 to 2007 to 2014, and quite a journey there. But a lot of the lessons I learned is how what I applied to in my freelancing journey, which is what helped me to achieve the type of success that I've had. So a lot of failure along the way, and then that failure I channeled that into lessons learned, and then those lessons helped me become successful as a freelancer. So sometimes that wandering in the desert season may feel like a waste when it's happening, but is often redeemed in the future. So,
amen, dude. Already dropping gems, and we're not even started yet.
Yeah,
all right. So the dangers of music. I wanted to summarize this, the pain, the gain of it, by first going into the concept of a cage. The cage concept I've kind of developed over the years, and I'm just kind of releasing more into the public now. The cage is an abbreviation for complacency, atrophy, guilt, and lastly, the escape. So these are the major phases of being able to go from pain to gain.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and jump right into how we could do that in terms of music, because this is a major part of our lives nowadays.
Yeah.
So we could just jump right into some of the statistics behind it.
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah. So the American Psychological Association, this is an article on their website. They followed this study that challenges the ancient Greek catharsis hypothesis.
Okay.
It claims that expressing aggressive emotion will later decrease aggressive behavior. Instead, researchers from Iowa State University and Texas Department of Human Services found that aggressive music lyrics increase aggressive thoughts and feelings, which might perpetuate aggressive behavior and have long-term effects, such as influencing listeners' perceptions of society and contributing to the development of aggressive personalities. And speaking of development, that first brings me to children.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the main concern that brought out to me there. Did you want to touch on that, Jason, before I resume?
Well, what I'm wondering is, or what I'm reminded of is that verse. I think it's in Matthew, from the words of Jesus, and he speaks about it's not what goes in, what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes, or sorry, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. So the reason that came to mind is the what we put into ourselves has an effect on who we are and who we become. And so as much as we might not like that idea, it's possible. So there's also some psychological research I've seen for people, less mature people, particularly children, that are highly influenced by the words that are spoken to them by their teachers, by their parents. And so the younger or less mature someone is, the weight of those words actually has a greater meaning. And I can imagine that people that are, have wounds and trauma, or have broken homes or broken families, when they're listening to certain types of music, it can have a larger influence and impact, especially if their friends are listening to that, in a way that it internalizes it in a deeper level. So does that make sense? You resonate with any of that?
Yeah, I actually brought a connection point to when I was a website developer also. The
Okay.
concept of garbage in, garbage out. It describes how when a database is intaking data, whenever it gets rendered on a website, will
Yeah.
be immediately garbage also.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting connection to that.
And there is an aspect of sacrifice that comes to mind. When I just think about the music I listen to, there's sometimes there's like a really great song, but there's like a part of it or a few sentences that are just like really bad, or it uses some kind of language. It's just really off-putting, and it's disappointing. Like, oh, I really like this song, but it's got this thing in it that I sort of have to let it go. And so that I can imagine, that a lot of people have a hard time with that, especially if you've been ingrained with a certain type of music for a long period of time.
Yeah, and that brings me to, I think by the end of this episode, we're going to determine something like, it's not necessarily take the water with the baby, throw it out, whatever, baby with the bathwater. I think we're going to come to just be able to discern what's going into your body and be careful with it. I don't think that we're going to necessarily end this episode with, don't you do that for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think we have to be virtuous is to learn when things are appropriate or when they're not, and how. And sometimes there are general rules we can follow, but yeah, that's helpful to know when to apply it. So you mentioned CAGE, which is complacency, atrophy, guilt, and escape. Do you want to maybe dive into each of the four of those in a little more detail, starting with complacency?
Yeah, before I do that, let me wrap up these last little studies.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
This diagram on how music affects the brain. And as you can see, it affects quite a bit. I'll put the references in the description. The major sections, the frontal lobe, even middle, top, back, all of the above. So it's interesting how the brain kind of responds to that. But more specifically, the biggest circle in that is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe controls planning, self-control, memory formation, empathy, and attention. It's also the biggest part of the cerebral hemisphere. It's larger and more developed in humans than any other organism. So that was also interesting to me as we talk also about the children aspect as to what's plopping in there as they're growing up, what's normal, what's not normal, gets determined also by music. The more repetition a child hears it, right?
Yeah. And
you being a father of 5 children know how much
yes.
repetition happens with music and movies and all this stuff.
Yeah, in fact, that's discipline, right? Is repeating, don't do this, do this, don't do this, do that, just saying it over and over. And even as adults, we need that as well. So yeah, that repetition is definitely important. And as often we can be sick of the repetition, but it's actually leaders are repeaters. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And I hope that many of the listeners want to be leaders or just want to continue being greater leaders.
Yeah. Yeah.
So complacency. This is probably could apply to across the board our entire society in many ways. But what do you think, and how it applies to music, Jason?
Well, I guess the one thing that comes to mind is with complacency. Well, I'll kind of rewind. I'm born in '84, so I grew up with this thing called the radio. And the radio, it played music by its own accord. It played whatever it played, and so you had to listen to it or you didn't, or change the channel. And so there's a lot more control over what we listen to now in terms of like Spotify or whatever, where you can essentially choose what you want to listen to. But I think what comes to mind with just the idea of complacency is that a lot of music that we listen to probably isn't entirely our choice. You go to a sports game, you go to church, you drive with someone, and the music is often selected for us. So that's one thing that comes to mind in terms of just music. And that complacency bears kind of comfort in the sense that we like the song, we heard it, but we haven't maybe even thought about what that song means, what it's saying, how it's affecting us. So I don't know. What do you think about complacency?
There's another aspect of this that comes up, which applies to TV and other media, which would be separate episodes. But there is also an aspect of there is no option. Of when you're listening to pop music, there's a generic theme of misogyny and just disrespect that's kind of imbued in between the lines. And one of the talking points I had was also when I was growing up, even, we're not even just talking about now, there were songs that it sounded good, makes you want to move your booty. But when I reflect on it, for example, this song by the artist named Next, it's called Too Close. When I was, as an adult, thinking about, I was curious what the lyrics mean on this. And it was actually openly talking about erections. I was like, oh my, I was an 11-year-old. And I, looking back, acted on those things that the song was saying, kind of almost making a facetious thing of them and how to behave with them in terms of women, females.
Yeah.
And I realized, I acted inappropriately. I can't necessarily blame that song. But as a child, I could also see how I could be, what's the word I'm looking for, Jason? Kind of made
susceptible,
or like this is just innocent behavior, right?
Oh, okay. Naive. Yeah.
I could relate it to how, actually this was even true growing up. Like twerking has become a normal thing. But this is actually pretty, like, I don't want my child doing that, right?
Yeah.
I remember my mom even was like curious. She just heard about the concept of twerking. She didn't know what it looked like or what it was. And she said, oh, I heard about this in the news the other day. Could you teach me? I was like, oh, no, never.
So what was, I guess, when you were growing up, what was the relationship between you and your parents in regards to musical censorship? Like, did you have free reign to listen to whatever you wanted? Did they, did you have restrictions? How did that play out for you?
No, there was no restrictions. The only restriction was like staying up too late, getting my door knocked off or something. Like, hey, turn that off, turn the computer off.
Was that something that you wished you had at the time or in retrospect?
I think an even larger question would be, do I wish I had a conversation, not just about music, but maybe about even sex and other kind of topics that were floating in my brain, which I didn't have. And there's also a subject of why this podcast even exists.
So it's really, it filled a gap for you that wasn't filled in any other way. And so you're working with perhaps the bottom of the barrel insights or wisdom because
Yeah.
it's this particular song, as you gave an example, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was on a pop station too all the time. So it's not like you could just avoid it.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot more control now, right? If you have access to a phone or computer, I
Mhm.
could control what I want to listen to.
Was there a dynamic that has to do with, okay, this is a popular song right now, and so I want to like it because everyone else likes it and kind of want to be included? Is
Yeah.
that part of it?
Yeah. There's a peer thing to it, right?
Yeah.
I even used to burn CDs for friends, and they would listen to stuff like that and want me to burn
Yeah.
those songs
Yeah.
into the CDs.
So, okay, so that's complacency. So talk to us about atrophy.
Atrophy, this is where more of the subversion goes on,
Okay.
right? We're talking about once you've numbed, like we're talking about the brain into thinking something's normal. Now this is a new normal.
Okay.
So it makes me think of how some saying something 30 years ago would have been okay as a universal truth, but in today's society, you would be a pariah.
Yeah.
Jason, what's an example of that?
Um, hmm. Well, I'm trying to, yeah, nothing's coming to mind. I'm blanking.
Okay. I'm glad I challenged you. I can
Got
think of
me.
one right now.
All right, go ahead.
So the whole kind of allowing transgender folks into competitions,
Okay.
whereas we know this scientifically, genetically, like if we're even talking about just the wrist, a male's wrist is like 10, 20x stronger than a female's wrist.
Yeah.
You can't just outright say this is okay to just allow these sort of folks. I love them to death. Hey, I've had many meals with transgender folks, and they're great people. I love them. But to say it's okay just because of this is what I want to do with my life, there's no end to that. What I see, and there's a danger to that, right?
Well, I
And
think what you're trying to, maybe the root of what you're trying to say is there's a difference between choosing how to live our life however we want in an autonomous fashion, regardless of maybe the realities at hand. And the difference between someone who might believe that life is designed a particular way in which we're supposed to live within that constraint. Is that what I'm hearing?
yeah, it's kind of like I guess biblical versus not so biblical.
Yeah, but I think I would even say because you could have some of that type of delineation of, well, what is biblical and what isn't, and you'd have disagreements about that from different points of view. So it would be maybe a subset of that. But there is a distinct difference between I don't really care what the truth is, or I don't care what the reality is. I want to choose my own way and choose how I want to go about it, versus at least diligently, wrestling with those divinely directed the designs, the ways of life that are biblical, but also required to be wrestled with because it's not always obvious or clear how
Yeah,
those
or
play
easy.
out. Or easy. Yeah.
Because sometimes it takes years or decades, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And I think I guess the other thing that comes to mind, just the difference between simple issues versus complex ones. I think we tend to want to make complex issues overly simplistic instead of engaging with the complexities of reality. And that goes both ways, politically or religious or non-religious, those types of dynamics.
mhm. And now we got to drive it back home somehow to atrophy.
So atrophy being, I guess atrophy is a reversion of what it ought to be, or what's, if you have a strong muscle, it's going to atrophy over time. If it's not used, then it's going to shrink and it's going to become weak. And I think the way that we understand the world and how we operate in it can either strengthen or weaken us. And I think in many ways it weakens us when we can also think it's strengthening us when it's really weakening us, and that can lead us into situations that we're not prepared for when they hit. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. It brings up another probably entire topic of another episode, which is the definition of hedonism. The fact of I want to just do whatever I want to do because it makes me feel good.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was trying to allude to as like the autonomous path.
Yeah.
Um,
But there's consequences to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I may choose something, I may want it, and no one may stop me, but I still have to deal with the consequences. And that's the thing we can never escape, no matter how autonomous we want to try and be.
Yeah.
So I think with atrophy, I think how it comes back in terms of like your example of growing up and listening to music and it impacting you in a certain way led you to live a certain way or to want to live a certain way and to act a certain way. And the ways that it drove you were in a way that I think weakened you over time and put you into bad situations and created brokenness. And so I wonder if the connection to the atrophy that I think of is just this idea of being vulnerable, broken and vulnerable. And maybe that ties into the next word, which is the guilt.
Oh man, that is such a solid way to put it. And before we jump into that, atrophy in a natural sense, music wasn't the only factor in putting me into a weakened state. I could put it in all sorts of things, the habits I allowed to happen, the relationships that I allowed to happen. So it's all a part of the bigger equation. But yeah, ultimately it rolls up to guilt. Like, I wish I should have done that, wish I should have done this. But I guess in relating to the subversiveness, the subconscious normal, there's also an aspect of not being able to control certain things.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the guilt, like, especially if it leads to us making a regrettable decision, an irreversible regrettable decision, then that guilt can be crippling, right?
Yeah. Crippling. And I learned of a different take on guilt and the other day that we could touch on for a second here too. This is a critical aspect of why guilt is so important too, is that if we have drastic guilt, it could turn into shame. And the difference between shame and guilt are massive, like worlds of difference. Like we're talking Mars and Earth. Shame is I am a bad person, and I just do bad things like this. It's a innumerable identity of I have shame. I am a shameful person. I do shameful things. That's what shame is, identity based.
Yeah.
Guilt is more of I did a bad thing. I should not have kicked that little shrub over there. That was bad for that shrub. You see, that's more of an action thing that you could reflect on and build from. Versus identity is, I'm a bad person. I do bad things. I am ashamed of that. So we have two worlds that we have to reconcile. But this is not good for you because you could just live in that for decades, years. I've done that myself. And then so guilt is the most important thing we got to overcome here. So how do we overcome guilt in terms of the things we've heard allowed into our bodies? What's your thoughts, Jason?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. First is the thing that we're feeling guilty about, is it something we're actually guilty for?
Oh man.
So yeah, we can be made to feel guilty for something that is not our fault. Maybe another layer of that that's a little bit more nuanced is perhaps the guilt we have is only a percentage. So let's say there's a situation with you and a friend, and it goes south. Perhaps I'm responsible for 90% of it failing, or perhaps I'm 10% responsible. Whatever it is, I can take the guilt of the entire 100%, or I can also not take any of the guilt, right? And so, so also it's not just whether I am guilty or not, but also to what degree am I, is an appropriate level of ownership in that particular guilt. So that's kind of one layer. And then the other aspect of it is, okay, I am legit. What do I do? I'm legitimately guilty. How do I reconcile that? And I think as a follower of Christ, what I'm told and what I'm inspired to be is, I am guilty, but yet the debt of which makes me guilty has been paid. And so I am no longer guilty because that debt has been paid. But as a result of that, to receive that is to repent of that guilt, to receive the mercy, to receive the grace, and then to accept it. And so a lot of times, so we as humans, we have to reconcile guilt. And as a Christian, that's how that plays out. And without that, it's a very difficult thing to navigate and to deal with, because there are things in life that we are truly guilty for. And we hurt people. We do things we shouldn't. We, even by our own standards, not even by other standards, by our own standards. And so we have to really wrestle with that guilt. So those are kind of two layers that come to mind for me. How about you?
What you said towards the beginning really hit me, because I also know people that actively don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also a subject of our society that almost encourages, like, oh, it's just rap. Oh, it's just a beat. It makes me feel good. I want to listen to this bumping down the street. It makes me feel, this could be applied to a lot of different aspects of life, but in music and how it connects to, I guess, in America, it's exemplified that I'm gonna do me. I'm gonna do what makes me feel good. It's
and that's that, like you said, hedonism.
Coming back to it.
Yeah. So it's my way, or it's God's way, right? So which am I going to choose?
Yeah. And if we can't even overcome that, I guess that relates back to atrophy. If we can't even get back to that, we can't even get to guilt. We can't have remorse of how this is affecting our children. We can't have remorse of how this is affecting how we live our lives. to the first point, that erections are facetious, and it almost seemed to imply that all females wanted to feel it upon their bodies, type thing. Like, to not even see it as an issue, you can't.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that would be a certain type of reasoning would be to say that, hey, as long as you're not hurting anyone, or you're not hurting them within certain limitations, you do you believe what you want to believe, you live your truth, those kind of things, right? It's that autonomous spirit. But is that really what it means to be human? Is that really what it is that the way we're supposed to live? Are we independent, or are we dependent on each other?
Are we all independent women?
I don't know what you mean by that, but
it's a Beyonce song.
Okay. So yeah, there is definitely a spirit of that autonomy, and I think as Americans, it's probably more pervasive than other parts of the world. But we do believe that we can kind of live on our own. We are our own island, and I think that is going to get us further away from who we are and what we're supposed to be.
Now that I mentioned that Beyonce song, it brings up the matter of the complete fork in the road of male and female identity structures. On one side, we have songs saying treat women essentially like garbage, and supporting that, encouraging that, celebrating that. On the other hand, we have kind of women encouraging independence, doing your own thing, not necessarily getting hitched down. And it's almost forcing a complete conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's the inevitability of that autonomous spirit is you're going to have a lot of, essentially, if you have everyone going in all these different directions, you're going to have a lot of conflict.
Mhm.
And because it's going to be in all of these different areas.
Yeah.
If I go left, you go right. If I go left and up and you go down and right, we're going to start, and the further you are from a particular person, the more conflict there's going to be. And so everyone's going to have their own way. And that's kind of the definition of a secular age, that there is no privileged point of view. Everyone has their own point of view or own truth, but there is nothing that transcends that. And so it's simply a matter of who's maybe the most persuasive, the most powerful. It comes down to something else in terms of enforcement of that belief, because why should I believe what you believe, or why should you believe what I believe? And then the system, the law, the justice system becomes a arbiter of trying to prevent the conflict from erupting, getting too out of hand, right?
Yeah. An arbiter of unlimited variables, basically.
Yeah, which is very difficult to navigate. So,
yeah.
So we've got atrophy, guilt.
Hold on, there's one more thing I want to touch on. On the drive in today, I was realizing, I even heard this on YouTube the other day, a lot of Disney movies, I know this is another topic, should be another episode, but a lot of Disney movies have separated families, like step families, and they're not together, basically divorced parents. And I realized, whoa, so this is totally normalized. It's almost not normal to have a united family anymore. That's going to be a whole different topic we could touch on. But that is pretty scary, pretty terrifying, right? Because now we're talking about actual intentional divisions that are normalized. But okay, that's a tangent.
Well, yeah, and I guess so. The one thing I would say is that I actually think that tends to be more of a reflection of the reality that we live, than the creator of it, right? So what's the chicken or the egg? I think our creative outlets tend to be a reflection of us. So, and back to the music, I do wonder if the people creating these songs that we're talking about, or that you mentioned, who are they and what's the life they live that caused them to become the person they are, who created the music they created. And so that it just brings to mind this idea of this intergenerational cycle of brokenness that just perpetuates, and eventually it escalates in a way that it's more pervasive throughout society.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting, and maybe that ties into the next part, which is the escape. How does escape play into this?
The escape, ultimately, I feel, comes down to discernment. The ability to say, I don't want this for myself, I don't want this for my family. And whenever I do want this, I have to be mindful to maybe pray after it, maybe have some sort of way to, counteract what just went into your body. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite artists is Patrick Wolf. He's a London-based artist.
Okay.
And in his songs, it's a sweet romantic song. It's beautiful. I think I'm going to sing it at my ceremony whenever we get around to that.
Okay.
But it talks about, she unfolds her hand for him to put on the ring or something like that. And it kind of has a counterbalance of like, he unfolds his hand to her. And then a couple years after I sung the song, probably hundreds of times, I finally looked at the lyrics, and it does has a specific lyric saying, he unfolds his hand to him. And I thought it was heterosexual. I didn't know it was actually saying it was a homosexual relationship towards the end of the song. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Don't come after me saying I'm anti-gay. I'm just saying, why was it slipped in there towards the end of the song, right? On the same note, ASMR, this is this YouTube and even on Apple Music now thing that helps me sleep. And there's this ASMR artist that from the beginning 2/3 of it was just an innocent pretending to be a British tailor, you know, kind of preparing a suit for me. And that's kind of a cool thing, you know, as a man, getting a suit prepared for. But towards the end of the 1/3, I'm glad I listened to this because I could be sleeping by that time. Kind of helps me to sleep, right? The end 1/3, the guy is actually preparing some heels, specifically red heels. He even brings it into the video. And he said, oh, these are the heels that you asked me for earlier in our phone conversation. And that, more than the previous point, the Patrick Wolf song, just pissed me off. I should not be subconsciously in the middle of my sleep, getting my thoughts altered, basically, because that's what subliminal messages do, right? That sort of thing sort of ties into music because it's just audio. It bothers me. I should not have my brain played with when I'm not even thinking it should be. What's your thoughts on this statement, Jason?
Well, so escape, I mean, we escape, I mean, life is tragic. Life is tragedy. Life is suffering. That's outside the cross. That's how reality. It's just brutal. But with Christ on the cross, it provides redemption. And so there's I guess a double-sided edge with the escape. We want to get away from the pain. We want to get away from the suffering. We don't want to go into the fire. And so we choose lots of ways to get out of it. And with ways to not feel, ways to not think, ways eventually, you know, someone might consider not living. So the suffering and the pain, it is very difficult and very hard. And, you know, not like we should want to suffer, but we also, when we do suffer, we do not necessarily as humans manage it well. And so we want to get away from that. And but there is something, and you know, this is the essence of your show, From Pain to Gain. There's something about walking through the pain, walking through the suffering for a greater purpose, for the light on the other side of the darkness. And so instead of perpetuating our pain and suffering, we can essentially lean into the pain and suffering to exit the pain and suffering for a better future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we can't really appreciate the grace God has for us unless we've actually been down the spiral, one could say. I could definitely relate to that in my 20s. I lived all sorts of a hedonistic lifestyle. And ultimately I was like, where have I gone? So there's a value to that too. And life is suffering. And I feel like God is not just letting all this happen just because well, a lot of people say, right, oh, he must be an evil guy up there. But I think there's a purpose for it, for us to understand all sides of the coin, because I think there's something bigger that's going to transpire when we're with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have to trust, we trust in God that as bad as it is, as bad as it gets, or as good as it gets, or as good as it is, that he is good and that he is orchestrating things for the greater good. And sometimes we can't see what that is. So it's hard to trust when you can't see. But what's the alternative? The alternative is not, what's the alternative explanation to that? And I don't know that there is one. So the alternative explanation is that we are on our own. No one is going to help us. So buckle down and hold on to your butts.
Or my phrase, wish upon a star that something will be okay.
Yeah, and so we can be overly optimistic, and that can actually further despair when that hope isn't connected to something transcendent or real.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that brings me to a concept of the Buddhism culture, which is completely opposite of Christ. The karma, karma is real type thing. So if we're to have this perspective of evil was done to us or evil was done to another, we're always going to be drowning. We're always going to be in a downward spiral because of the debt is just so massive. But when it comes to Jesus, there's no debt that's big enough to prevent.
Yeah, and so and Buddhism is connected to Hinduism, which is where the karma, I think, originates. But one of the interesting things in the Indian culture is with karma specifically is because if that's true, if the life you're living now is based on a past life and you are suffering now because of what you've done in the past, then that means you can't help people that are suffering because you're essentially you're helping them when they should be suffering. Oh. And so to help them is actually unjust, which is very much a clash with Christianity, which Christ says, what you do to them, the least of them, the least of these, you do to me. And so as Christians, we're compelled to help them, but it does create these two worldviews, see it completely differently, and it creates a clash. And so how we see the world makes a difference, and it makes a difference in how we endure it and how we see others and how we engage with others.
Yeah. And how I see you as my BFF,
triple Fs. So let's wrap it up here. We got cage, complacency, atrophy, guilt, escape, pain to gain. We talked about autonomy versus living within, submitting to a design of life versus designing our own life, which can manifest in a lot of different ways. Where we choose our biological composition, our sexual preferences, our sexual acts, the difference between designing our life the way we want it versus living our life within a design that's been created for us. And we really incline, or we move towards choosing our own adventure. But the further we get away from the design of life, the more suffering and pain we cause for ourselves and others. And so it's through that process of becoming complacent, atrophying, weakening, experiencing that guilt and trying to escape that guilt through unhealthy channels. And music might be one of those channels. Or it might be something that shapes how we understand tragedy and how we understand life and our identity. But I think ultimately there are a lot of people that are confused. I think things are complex, and I think we have a hard time understanding that complexity and communicating to it and through it. And we are lost in many ways. We are utterly dependent on on something outside ourselves But if all we have is ourselves, then it's only going to continue.
Yeah.
So any final words for you?
Suggestion was to escape was discernment in a shell. What's yours?
Say that again.
My suggestion to escape the end point was to discern as best you can, basically. What's kind of your suggestion on that?
Yeah, I kind of it's to escape is to run away, it's to flee. And so perhaps the alternative would be to face whatever it is I'm escaping, to look at it head on and face it directly. I kind of think of the end of the first Matrix. He's running from Agent Smith. He's running like the whole movie. And at the end of the movies, he's face to face with him, right? And it's not entirely his choice, but that's the way it worked out. So he turns to him and he faces it. And it, in that case, it costs him his life, of which he's resuscitated, but resurrected. But facing whatever we're running away from head on. And it's going to be hard and it's going to hurt.
But ultimately,
So, yeah.
you can escape from whatever you're
Yeah.
going through. That's going to be another topic too. I had a nightmare recently that is tied into the Matrix and how we are basically in a Matrix, but it's a lot more subversive, a lot more real. It's not a movie. So I'll talk to that nightmare I had a couple episodes from now. But anyways, thank you so much, Jason. The amazing insights you provided, the great questions. Can't wait to see you again, brother.
All right. Sounds good.